Tell me, Muse, of the man of many ways who was driven far journeys after he had sacked Troy's sacred citadel. Many were there whose cities he saw, whose minds he learned of. Many the pains he suffered in his spirit on the wide sea, struggling for his own life and the homecoming of his companions. Even so, he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to. They were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the days of their homecoming. From some point here, goddess, daughter of Zeus, speak and begin our story. These sentences mark the beginning of the Odyssey, one of the greatest epics ever to be composed in ancient Greece and possibly in the entire world. That's for you to decide. In these few introductory lines, the main topics are already pointed out. The main character of the story is Odysseus. He's one of the heroes of the Trojan War. Also, his main desire is mentioned: homecoming. It furthermore becomes clear that he encountered substantial difficulties in fulfilling his desire. Before we can embark on exploring the contents of the story and get better acquainted with its hero, Odysseus, we first have to look at some background information, such as who wrote the story, when was it composed, and what was the society like in the times of Odysseus. The Odyssey was written by the poet Homer in the late 8th century BC. Very little is surprisingly known about Homer. He lived in the second half of the 8th century BC in the area around Smyrna, which is today's Izmir on the west coast of Turkey. And he wrote at least one other great epic, the Iliad, which tells a story from the Trojan War. In contrast to many legends and stories which relate that Homer was poor and from a low social class, an analysis of the epics themselves clearly show that he was a professional poet associated with the nobility, possibly even of noble origin himself. The high position of a poet at this time at the court is clearly illustrated by the way how Demodocus at the Phaeacian court is described in Book 8. Both epics, the Iliad as well as the Odyssey, relate to stories from a distant past, which according to Greek belief dated around the year 1200 BC. That is the story of the Trojan War and its aftermath. It is hotly debated among modern scholars how far both epics and especially the story of the Trojan War actually reflect historical truth. But it may be speculated that at least some historical facts may be hidden in the stories. For the ancient Greeks, however, these stories reflected historical reality. Homer used stories that were well known in Greece at this time and very likely were orally transmitted already for several centuries. The 8th century in Greece was a heroic age. The society was still dominated by kings who reigned over small regional kingdoms in various parts of Greece. That means Greece at this time was not politically united. These little Greek kings and princes actually probably more often fought against each other than, as told in the story of the Trojan War, they united against a common enemy. Writing had only recently been introduced from the Near East, that is, from Phoenicia, from this part of the world, to Greece. Thus, it is quite astonishing to have lengthy epics of a high literary quality, such as the Iliad and the Odyssey, as the first literary products of Greece. In fact, one of the earliest inscriptions in Greek, dating from the end of the 8th century, contains a reference to Homer's Iliad. That is actually shown here on this slide. I'm, after all, an archaeologist, so I need to introduce you to a bit of archaeology. We're dealing with a Greek vessel here into which someone had scratched the inscription that you see below, and it refers to a drinking cup that King Nestor, one of the Greek kings in the Iliad, owned. So a clear reference to a literary work composed by Homer. So in short, literacy in Greece seems to have started with a big bang. Epics themselves, of course, had a longer history in Greece. An epic is a heroic story mixing real, that is, historical, and fictional elements. For instance, the appearance of gods and monsters in the stories. Poets and bards sang these epics at the court of kings and nobles, certainly for entertainment, but more importantly, to transmit values of the society to the audience. As I already said, these epics were transmitted orally for a very long time. Thus, their contents were known by most people. Homer, therefore, did not need to tell the whole story of the Trojan War and the homecoming of the heroes, but he could focus on the most dramatic aspects. For the sake of clarity, first the correct chronological order of the events will be summed up here. The Odyssey takes its name from its hero, Odysseus. Odysseus was the king of Ithaca, a small island on the west coast of Greece. For 10 years, he fought in the Trojan War. Odysseus actually figures as one of the more important heroes in Homer's Iliad, which tells an episode of the Trojan War. It was he who constructed the wooden horse by which the Greeks finally managed to conquer Troy. Our story, the Odyssey, however, starts after the conquest of Troy. It tells the story of Odysseus' homecoming. So, after Odysseus had left Troy, he planned directly to sail back to his home on Ithaca with all his men and the spoils of war he had gained when sacking Troy. However, storms and various adventures prevented him from coming home directly, and during these wanderings, which lasted for another 10 years, he lost all his ships and his companions. The reasons for his misfortunes are mainly due to the wrath of Poseidon, the god of the sea, whose son Polyphemus, the Cyclops, Odysseus had blinded. It has to be pointed out here that Odysseus had no intention to offend the gods. He only blinded the Cyclops in self-defense to save his own life. We will have to come back to this point later during the lecture. Lastly, Odysseus alone arrived on the island of the nymph Calypso, who fell in love with him and wanted to marry him. She even offered Odysseus eternal life, which is quite interesting. You just have read the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance, and Gilgamesh's main desire, at least in the beginning, is to have eternal life. Interestingly, Odysseus is very different. Odysseus, however, was still determined to return home and at last built a raft on which he managed to reach the island of Scheria, where the Phaeacians lived. He received a hearty welcome there, and after having spent some time as a guest of King Alkinoos, he was brought by the Phaeacians back to his own island of Ithaca. As Odysseus, upon his return, had no idea what was going on in his own home, on the advice of the goddess Athena, he disguised himself as a beggar to find out more about the situation on his own island. He first stayed with Eumaeus, the swineherd, who informed him about the general situation, which, to say the least, did not look good. Odysseus kept his disguise and only lifted it when he met his own son Telemachus. Telemachus brought Odysseus to the palace, where again he went in the disguise of a beggar. There he finds out how the suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, abuse the concept of hospitality, harass his wife, and Odysseus himself is actually being humiliated by them. When his wife Penelope interviews Odysseus, he tells her a false story of his fate. The story comes to its climax when Penelope proposes a contest for the suitors, in which they are to string Odysseus' great bow and shoot an arrow through the shaft holes of 12 axes. She then will marry the winner of this contest. Not surprisingly, none of the suitors can even string the bow, and in the end, only Odysseus is able to fulfill the task. Finally, he reveals himself, and together with his son Telemachus and the help of Athena, kills all the suitors. But Penelope remains cautious, and before finally accepting that Odysseus has really returned to her, puts him to a last test when asking him about the special features of the bed in his own bedchamber. The point of the story is the bed was built around an olive tree, so that means it cannot be moved. And to test Odysseus, Penelope says, "Oh, I'll move your bed to another room," and so on. And he gets furious and says, "What? Did you cut down the olive tree?" And the point is that only very, very few people have seen this bed. So that is Penelope's way to find out if Odysseus is the real Odysseus and not just an imposter. The story ends with another fighting scene in which the relatives of the killed suitors seek revenge, but this fight is ended by a peace imposed by the goddess Athena. Homer, however, told the story in a somewhat different way. I've already pointed out, as the contents of the story of Odysseus were well known in Homer's time, the poet did not need to retell all the events in correct order. He only focused on the most decisive points of the story. In altogether, only a period of 40 actual days is covered in the Odyssey, starting from the point when Odysseus is finally allowed to leave the island of Calypso until his re-establishment as the king of Ithaca. Homer's Odyssey is subdivided into 24 chapters, or books, as it is commonly referred to. Book 1 acts as a kind of prologue, in which, by a council of the gods, Odysseus finally is allowed to return home from the island of Calypso. Books 2 to 4, instead of setting Odysseus on his way home, first tell the story of the journey which Odysseus' son Telemachus undertakes to find out news about his missing father. These books convey important information, as they explain to the reader the desolate situation in Odysseus' kingdom. Although Odysseus has been away for 20 years now, his wife Penelope still does believe that he will eventually return home. However, a group of suitors, young noblemen from Ithaca, urge her to forget Odysseus and marry one of them instead. This situation is bound to create tensions. Will Penelope remain loyal to Odysseus? How will the suitors react should Odysseus eventually return home? And what about Telemachus, Odysseus' son? When Odysseus left 20 years ago, Telemachus was just a baby, so he has absolutely no memories of his father. So how will Telemachus react to the reappearance of Odysseus? It is only in Book 5 that we return to our hero Odysseus and learn how he built a raft by which he leaves Calypso's island. On his way home to Ithaca, he's shipwrecked once again due to Poseidon's wrath and barely manages to reach Scheria, the island of the Phaeacians. In books 6 to 12, Odysseus' stay on the island of Scheria is described, and in books 9 to 12, he actually tells the story of his wanderings and adventures to the Phaeacians. This order of events is quite important. When we first met Odysseus on Calypso's island, he was a broken man, weeping out of desperation. However, by retelling all his adventures to the Phaeacians, he regains his confidence and thus gains the strength to restore order to his own kingdom. From Book 13 onwards, Homer's version follows the correct chronological order as detailed above. This arrangement of the story actually reflects the succeeding stages of Odysseus' homecoming. Books 5 to 12 tell about Odysseus' wanderings in the Mediterranean. Books 13 to 16 tell about Odysseus on his own island of Ithaca, but still outside of the palace. In books 17 to 22, the adventures inside the palace are told, and it is only in book 23 that Odysseus finally reaches his own bedchamber, the innermost part of the palace. Just to give you, can you hear me without the microphone? Okay. So just to give you an idea what this diagram actually means, it means the arrow represents the passage of time. We have 10 years of the Trojan War in which Odysseus fought, and then the 10 additional years which Odysseus spent wandering around the Mediterranean. The period actually discovered, they're actually covered by the Odyssey, are only the last 40 days of these stories. But, as I just said, books 9 to 12, we have this so-called retrospective, where Odysseus tells his adventures to the Phaeacians from the conquest of Troy until he actually arrives on their island. So this is this one. It should be noted that Odysseus' wanderings, interestingly, take place outside of the real world. What do I mean by this? It is only the starting point, Troy, and the end point, Ithaca, that are places that can securely be put on a map. All other locations of Odysseus' adventures have no secure position in the Mediterranean or elsewhere, and the various attempts by different scholars to identify the names of places in the epic, like the island of the Cyclops, the island of Calypso, Scheria, and so on. And the various attempts by different scholars to identify the names of the places in the epic with real place names are no more than guesswork. In contrast, the false stories which Odysseus tells several times about his wanderings all are situated in the real world, and the places he claims to have visited can be identified. The island of Crete, the region of Phoenicia, the country of Egypt, and so on. So Homer plays a quite interesting game here with the concept of reality versus invention. Odysseus' real wanderings happen in an invented world. His, let's say, false stories about his wanderings happen, let's say, in the real world. Quite interesting. You may want to discuss that in class. There are certainly many ways how to read the Odyssey. First of all, it is a fascinating adventure story, and without doubt was also understood as such in ancient Greece. However, the story also conveys moral issues important for the ancient Greek society. Let us first take a look at Odysseus, the hero of the story, as the main characters always served as role models for societies in general. So, as it should be clear by now, Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, is the hero of the story. He's characterized by a number of attributes. First of all, he is a hero. He can and does fight if necessary. An example of his superior strength is given in the story of the bow contest, Book 21, line 409, where it is said, I quote, "So, without any strain, Odysseus strung the great bow," end of quote. Remember, none of the suitors, for instance, even managed to do this task. They lacked the strength. Odysseus is a pious man. He's always honoring the gods. Most important, however, is his intelligence, his resourcefulness. Remember, it was not the brutal strength of Achilles, another one of the Greek heroes in the Trojan War, that led to the conquest of Troy, but Odysseus' plan of devising a stratagem, the wooden horse. We actually see that here on the left-hand side in a Greek depiction. So the idea is that the Greeks could not conquer the city of Troy because its walls were too strong. So Odysseus suggested, let's build a wooden horse, hide some warriors inside, the rest of us withdraw, and the Trojans will think, oh, the war has ended. They will drag the horse into their city, and then at night, these warriors hidden inside the horse would climb out, open the gate, and let the rest of the Greek army into the city. Okay, so Odysseus' intelligence, it's not only a cleverness helping him to survive, such as in the case of the escape from the cave of the Cyclops, but it is a genuine curiosity. For instance, Odysseus enters the cave of the Cyclops out of pure curiosity. He does not really need to go there. This is detailed in Book 9, line 172 and following, where it is said, I quote, "While I go and find out about these people and learn what they are, whether they are savage and violent and without justice, or hospitable to strangers with minds that are godly," end of quote. Another example is Odysseus' way of interrogating the spirits of the dead in the underworld in Book 11, line 228 and following, where it is said about Odysseus, "I then thought about a way to question them." That means the spirits of the dead. End of quote. Again, he just does that to gain knowledge, to satisfy his curiosity, but not really for any personal advantages. Odysseus is able to endure suffering to achieve his goals. It is basically his longing for his home and his family that led him to endure all his misfortunes. Most important is his determination. He uses all his resources to achieve one goal: coming home to his wife and son. Compared to the motivation of Gilgamesh, this seems a somewhat unheroic goal. However, it certainly makes Odysseus a more sympathetic character, not only for modern eyes. Odysseus has been called the first modern man by the 20th century philosophers Adorno and Horkheimer, for instance. He is not only a hero with strength and courage. Most famous, he is for his resourcefulness, his ingenuity. And as I pointed out, it is not only an ingenuity born out of the necessity to survive, but it is a genuine curiosity. It is the combination of these different attributes, his courage, his ability to endure suffering, but most important, his resourcefulness and curiosity, which truly make him one of the most fascinating Greek heroes. It is especially the latter attributes that actually pave the way to the so-called Greek Enlightenment during the 5th century and the following centuries, when philosophers and historians show the same kind of curiosity. They also want to gain knowledge for knowledge's sake, not just to survive. So you'll read some of these philosophers and historians, Thucydides, the historian, Aristotle and Plato among the philosophers, and so on. So keep this in mind. Further moral issues concern several different points. For instance, proper behavior in general. Homer is somewhat ambiguous when it comes to the question of fate versus free will. Several passages seem to indicate that the fate for humans was set by the gods. For instance, in Book 1, lines 16 and 17, where it is said, I quote, "When in the circling of the years that very year came in which the god had spun for him his time of homecoming." End of quote. It seems obvious that Odysseus was fated to wander around for 10 years after the Trojan War. There was nothing he could do to change it. On the other hand, we find passages that indicate that the gods sometimes revise their decisions according to the behavior of humans. So man is at least partly responsible for his fate. Recklessness and wrongdoing will lead to punishment by the gods, or in the case of the suitors, by Odysseus himself. This is clearly described again in Book 1, lines 6 to 9, where it is said, I quote, "Even so he could not save his companions, hard though he strove to, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness, fools who devoured the oxen of Helios, the sun god, and he took away the days of their homecoming. End of quote. So here the crucial sentence is, they were destroyed by their own wild recklessness. Another example is provided by Zeus, the supreme god himself, during the Council of the Gods at the very beginning of the story. So this is again book 1, lines 32 to 34, where Zeus himself addresses the other gods in the following words, I quote, "Oh, for shame, how the mortals put the blame upon us gods, for they say evils come from us, but it is they rather who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what is given." End of quote. So here again we have it, who by their own recklessness win sorrow beyond what is given. Ideas about proper behavior are expressed on several different occasions. A very important part in the story is the proper treatment of foreigners and guests. Compare, for instance, the correct behavior shown by Nestor in book 3, Telemachus in book 1, and the Phaeacians in book 7. So all these people properly receive guests, give them food, drink, give them presents, and so on. Compare that with the improper behavior of the Cyclops in book 9, who, instead of receiving Odysseus to his cave, starts to kill his companions, to eat them, and so on. So that's definitely a no-no. You don't kill foreigners and eat them. Hardly any society does that. So it just shows how uncivilized the Cyclops is. But, of course, also the guests themselves have obligations. You have, in exchange for the food and drink you get, you have to tell news. No internet at that time, no smartphones, and so on. So news traveled by people. And that means a guest has one major duty, that is informing the host about what's going on in the world. The suitors in Odysseus' palace clearly misbehave. They even insult other guests, such as Odysseus, who is disguised as a beggar. This is described in book 17. What, according to the Odyssey, makes human life valuable? Fame is definitely an important component for any man to establish his position in society. The Odyssey, curiously, is remarkable for putting less stress on fame gained by heroic deeds or in battle. See, for instance, the speech of Achilles in the underworld, in book 11, line 488 and following. So, Achilles has already been killed in the Trojan War, and now afterwards Odysseus visits the underworld. He's still alive, he's not dead. And Achilles addresses Odysseus with the following words, I quote, "O shining Odysseus, never console me for dying. I would rather follow the plow as a thrall," meaning a slave, "to another man, one with no land allotted him and not much to live on, than be a king over all the perished dead." End of quote. So, a little background information. Achilles, as a very young man, probably still a boy, was given the choice of having a short, glorious life as the best fighter in Greece, or a long, boring but peaceful life. And he said, I want the short, glorious one. And now that he's dead, he regrets his decision. So the Odyssey puts more stress on fame won at home by leading a proper life with family and friends. See, for instance, book 19, line 332 and following, where it is said, I quote, "But when a man is blameless himself and his thoughts are blameless, the friends he has entertained carry his fame widely." End of quote. These certainly can be seen as unheroic elements in the society. Contrast this attitude with the one propagated by the Epic of Gilgamesh, for instance. It has to be emphasized, however, that Odysseus is not portrayed as a peaceful man or even a coward. He can and does fight if necessary, but he is not only praised for his strength and his fighting qualities, but rather for his intelligence and his resourcefulness. If you want to put it in simple words, only muscles without a brain is not good enough. In addition, reputation rests on being a just man. This is, for instance, emphasized in Book 4, line 689 on following, where it is said about Odysseus, I quote, "What kind of man Odysseus was among your own parents, how he did no act and spoke no word in his own country that was unfair. And that is a way divine kings have. One may be hateful to a certain man and favor another, but Odysseus was never outrageous to any man." End of quote. What about attitudes towards the truth? When asked who he is, Odysseus several times embarks on a false story. For instance, in books 13, 14, 19, and so on. So to various people, even to the gods, the goddess Athena, for instance, he does not reveal his real name. He says, oh, I'm so-and-so, I'm not Odysseus, and so on. But this he does not do for simple cheating, but to protect himself until he finds out more about the situation in his country. It has been noted above that his false stories actually sound more credible than his real wanderings, as in the false stories no gods and monsters appear and the places he names actually can all be located. It is also important to note that once Odysseus revealed himself, he does not tell false stories anymore. That is from book 22 onwards. So he lies for a certain purpose, to protect his identity. He goes in disguise because, as he does not know anything about the situation in his own country, it would probably be unwise if after 20 years of absence he just walks into the palace and says, "Hi, honey, I'm back." Maybe his wife has already married somebody else. Who knows? So he needs to find out about these things. The more general attitude towards the truth in the epic is the concept that the truth is often hidden. Also, gods and even Odysseus appear in disguise. The moral of the epic in this case certainly is that one should not accept things as they first appear, as they appear on first sight, but to seek for a hidden truth. Lying is not condemned in the epic if it serves a purpose. See, for instance, Athena's speech to Odysseus in book 13, line 291 and following. So Athena, also in disguise, has just met Odysseus on the beach of Ithaca, and Odysseus says, "Oh, I'm a poor wanderer, I'm not sure where I am," and and so on. Athena, as a goddess, of course, knows exactly who he is, and she says, I quote, "You wretch, so devious, never wary of tricks, then you would not even in your own country give over your way of deceiving and your thievish tales. They are near to you in your very nature." Okay, that may sound a bit like criticism, but she continues. But come, let us talk no more of this, for you and I both know sharp practice. Since you are by far the best of all mortal men for counsel and stories, and I among all the divinities am famous for wit and sharpness. End of quote. So these last lines actually show what Athena thinks of Odysseus. She compares herself, she, a goddess, compares herself to Odysseus, a mortal man. And she says, hey, we both know how to deal with situations and so on. We are both intelligent. So that is certainly a compliment. So that brings us to the next issue, relations between man and gods. The ancient Greeks believed in many gods. Besides the main 12 Olympian gods, there was a multitude of minor gods in ancient Greece, for instance, the nymph Calypso who appears in this story. This situation is, of course, bound to create problems, as the gods do not always agree with each other. In the Trojan War, they even openly fight with each other, as some gods support the Trojan side, whereas others favor the Greeks. The gods in the Odyssey are all described with human characteristics. They quarrel, they're greedy, and they're sometimes unjust. Poseidon's hatred toward Odysseus is clearly a case of unjust behavior. Poseidon's wrath is purely based on personal motives, as Odysseus has blinded his son, the Cyclops. It's not a case of punishing Odysseus for unjust or immoral behavior. So, not all the gods are thus portrayed as higher moral authorities in this epic. Only Zeus clearly stands out as representing the principle of justice. But in general, the only aspects that distinguish all the gods from humans are their superhuman powers and the fact that gods are immortal. The gods do not only watch humans from far away, but actively engage themselves in human affairs, sometimes in a negative way, for instance, Poseidon shattering Odysseus' raft in Book 5, or in a positive way, the goddess Athena advising and protecting Odysseus, even making plans together with him in Book 13. The gods are parts of the human life and are portrayed by humans according to their own image. Nevertheless, it is made explicitly clear that the gods need to be honored, no matter how mean and unjust they are. Odysseus is clearly described as a pious man by Zeus himself. See the quotation in Book 1, lines 65 and following, where Zeus says about Odysseus, I quote, "How could I forget Odysseus, the godlike, he who is beyond all other men in mind, and who beyond others has given sacrifice to the gods who hold wide heaven." End of quote. Finally, the story of the Cyclops in Book 9, which I have already referred to several times, this is certainly one of the key events in the first 12 books, and thus it will be used here to illuminate some of the key concepts of the Odyssey. When looking at the description of the way of life of the Cyclopes, we obtain a clear idea of the Greek concept of civilization versus barbarity. The Cyclopes lack all essential features the Greeks associated with civilization. They have no agriculture, they live in caves instead of proper houses, they have no laws, they have no council meetings, they do not fear the gods, and they do not respect the laws of hospitality. So this is a kind of negative list. The Greeks associated a civilized life with exactly the opposite of what the Cyclopes are doing. Furthermore, this story brings out the main characteristics of Odysseus. It is first of all Odysseus' curiosity which brings him and his companion into a terribly dangerous situation, That means entering the cave of the Cyclops. On the other hand, through his cleverness and courage, Odysseus manages to rescue them again. Problem is, the Cyclops, a huge giant, closes the entrance to the cave with a big stone, so Odysseus and his men are trapped in there, and the Cyclops, for breakfast and for dinner, always kills 2 of each companions and eats them. So what are Odysseus and his companions to do to rescue themselves? Even if they kill the Cyclops while he's sleeping, they're still trapped in the cave. The stone is far too big to be moved. So I won't tell you the secret how Odysseus managed to get out. That you can read for yourself. But he did manage that in the end. Lastly, this story clearly illustrates the concept of being a hero. When first asked for his name by the Cyclops, Odysseus gives the very, very strange answer that it was nobody. This somewhat enigmatic response is explained only when, after being blinded, the Cyclops calls for help from his fellow Cyclopes, and when they arrive at our Cyclops cave and ask what happened, they hear, "Oh, nobody blinded me." So the other Cyclopes say, "Okay, maybe just a nightmare, a bad dream or whatsoever," and they return home to their own caves, and thus Odysseus and his companions are saved. While this clever trick saved Odysseus and his companions from the other Cyclopes, it unfortunately is at odds with the concept of heroism. A hero needs his proper name to be associated with his deeds. He needs the fame. It is for this reason, not just for pure recklessness, that Odysseus, once he has escaped from the cave, shouts his proper name to the Cyclops. The tragic irony of this act is that the Cyclops now has the personal details of his adversary, and he asks his father Poseidon to punish Odysseus. As we learn from the story, Odysseus will have to pay a heavy price for this, and he will have to use all his courage and his intelligence to escape Poseidon's wrath. But that is something that will be dealt with in the next lecture, next week, inshallah. Thank you for your attention. That's it.